Honorable Gisela Tete, then I'll come to leadership.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'm trying to get the formula you are using. It appears to me that you are doing, it appears to me you do 2 on their side and 1 on our side. It is becoming consistent. I'm just seeking your guidance. I'm just seeking your kind guidance. If it is the case that, with all due respect, I know you are very experienced in these matters. Is it the case that you are using a certain ratio that we are not aware of? If you can carry us along.
Honorable Minority Whip, sometimes I look at the number of people on their feet and I try to balance the equation.
Thank you for being definite that it is not a ratio that I was thinking, but it's members catching your attention. We'll try and catch your attention there.
Honorable Gisela Tete, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've learned to manage my expectations when it comes to the discussion on restitution, reparations, and restoration. Let me give a little example. In my little constituency, well, not a little constituency, in my constituency of Awutu Senya West, I have a fort called Fort Good Hope, which was built by the Dutch. And so one day, I decided to pay a visit to the Dutch embassy to have a discussion with the ambassador. And I said, oh, I have a fort in my place. I want to see what collaborations can be done with the fort in terms of tourism. I'd also read an article on Reuters that said that the Dutch PM, Mark Rutte, at the time, had apologized for the Dutch involvement in slavery. So I felt that was a good time to have it open up and have a discussion on my little fort sitting in Senya Breku. The PM had also indicated that they are not interested in reparations, but they will set up a 200 million euro education fund in lieu of that. And so I thought that I could tap into that education fund for my community of Senya Breku because the Fort Good Hope stands there as a relic up till today. I was disappointed when he said, actually, it was meant more for the colonies. So I said, oh, but there was an origin and there was a destination. The destination is the colonies, but the origin is the African coast. In Central region, there are over 17 or more forts and castles, and the evidence is there, even towards Ahanta, the cruel story of Bedu Bonsu, the second and all. So there's a long history of the Dutch involvement along our coast. I'm just using this as an example because it's a practical example for me. So I just realized that, okay, can I tap into the education fund as well? 200 million euro can do something. Can there be some technology transfer? Can I have a school built in my community by the Dutch? But I realized that the discussion was not going to go far. So at that point, I decided to advise myself. So much as I thank the speaker, the writer of this statement, I personally manage my expectations. And I think that as Africans, we must also go in with expectation management. Because somebody may not be on the same meter band as you are and thinking in the same terms of what sort of reparations. I don't think we want handouts, but I'm sure that some economic cooperation would do. Technology transfers would do. Access to education funds that were set up. This is just the Dutch example I've given you. There may be others along the way that have also done some kind of interventions. But I think that it should be more along those lines. So that the reality is that when, as we sit in here in this house, that we all represent a constituency, the ripple effect of that will be felt in a constituency like mine, where I have a relic built by the Dutch, every day reminding me of their presence. And I think that that discussion should link with tourism and others and make sure that at least the people who are affected by the slave trade, I wonder whether there will ever be closure, but at least there should be some discussion along those lines. But we are not there to beg. But I'm sure that at least some cooperation, technology transfer, as I said, or something more practical and pragmatic and beneficial to us as a people is something that at least we would not mind tapping into. I would like to translate all this into a benefit to my constituency. And I'm sure all of us who have such relics in our constituencies may want to do the same. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minority Leadership.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I commend the maker of this statement. Mr. Speaker, I have different views with reference to reparation in Africa. And it has to do with the fact that, Mr. Speaker, a friend once told me that if a ship was brought to the Tema port and people are asked whether or not they want to travel to America, and that they will be charged before traveling to America. Mr. Speaker, you and I know that a lot of people will jump onto that ship and travel to America. Mr. Speaker, the issues about reparation, whether or not we mean to deal with them, is a matter for us to think through carefully. What does reparatory justice for Africa entail? Does it entail we looking at a range of initiatives and how we intend to deal with these initiatives? Are we looking at historically acknowledging that we were once under the colonial spell? And are we willing to be compensated for those? Does it also entail we looking for financial reparations, some amount of money that will be paid as compensation to Africans that had to go through whatever reparations we went through? Does it also entail land restitutions, those lands which were taken from us? Are we willing to accept those lands and to take them and to walk away? Are we all thinking about these policy issues of policy reforms, including now departing from issues of social inequalities and discrimination? There are a host of issues we are dealing with as Africans. I think that I take a cue from my friend, Honorable Francis Xavier, that are we willing to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery? Are we willing to depart from the fact that we won't go and sit at one place applying for visa, and we know that the sun is scorching, there is no proper arrangements for people who even are applying and paying so much to travel to another country? Are we willing to depart from that? Within our same Africa, are we not getting the kind of discrimination we see every now and then, that even if you're going to a place like Morocco or Algeria, you don't see yourself as an African? Are we willing to also deal with the real issues of, say that from today, whatever we are due as Africans, we will treat ourselves as Africans? Honorable Patrick Boama made the call about when you are even traveling within Africa, and even in cases when you are supposed to procure some visas before you can get to your destination within Africa. And even the issue of transportation within Africa. You can best understand that sometimes when you're even traveling to Ivory Coast, and how you go and land in Ivory Coast, what is happening to AU and what is happening to EU within this shortest possible time? I think that as Africans, we must rise up to the occasion. We should stop just doing the theories and rhetorics and rise up to the core. Maybe that is also an occasion to say that Kwame Nkrumah did one of the best things by pushing for Africanization. But are we still willing to do it the way we think about it? Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. The indication is that I recognize Honorable Minority Chief Whip, Honorable Anodon.
Speaker, I am exceedingly grateful. I'm exceedingly grateful for your indulgence. So we are not to sound repetitive. I think colleagues have put matters in context, not according to any order. I've listened to my deputy, Honorable Ahmed, Honorable Sosu, my good friend, and the Honorable Boama, one thing comes to mind. Reparation, obviously, is not a beautiful thing to go for. It is not a low-hanging fruit that we can go for as a continent. Clearly, it cuts some doubts in terms of shadow on us as the independent, God-given people. It's not something we should be proud of. Reparation is out of the question. We should probably forcefully go out there and make a call for removal of trade tariffs and trade barriers. And that will set the stage for equal exchanges in terms of trade between Africa and ourselves and the other parts of the world. Speaker, it is strange that Africans are eager to trade with Europe in the face of the yawning gap. We have the Mediterranean Sea creating us a problem, a yawning gap, yet we feel more comfortable to trade with our brothers in Europe, whilst we can trade better amongst ourselves as Africans. Speaker, we've been talking about African Union, the continent coming together way ahead of the European Union. Before the Europeans started talking about their union, European Union, Africans have started talking about the unity of Africa and the African Union long ago. What happened? Along the line, today the European Union is much stronger in terms of geopolitics, and is doing better in terms of welfare, seeking welfare, and staging advocacy for trade and the development and changing the paradigm of development of Europe. They are way ahead of us. Speaker, I dare say that even before the Marshall Plan, Africans were on the path of progress and unity. After Europe was zeroed down by Hitler and Americans and co came together to put out the Marshall Plan, Africans were already talking about unity. And our torchbearers have always been talking about this. It's sad we are where we are, and today reparation becomes a subject matter of discussion. With greatest respect to our colleague, reparation should be pushed to the back burner. It cannot be. It cannot be. We cannot be satisfied with reparation. What we need is equal exchange in terms of trade. Today, one can recall all the economic interventions in Africa, PAMS card, economic recovery program, and all the likes. All these interventions have not helped ultimately. And so our torchbearers could not have been far from right when they said that Africans must take their destiny in our hands. And I couldn't have agreed more with Honorable Boama when he says we are going there to talk about theories again. And here I think individual African countries must rise up. And in our context, we can send a message through our foreign minister. Our foreign minister should send a message strongly to the African Union. If this is how we are going to be talking and we are still going to be swimming at the surf of the ocean, we are not helping the continent. And let me also conclude that we can't also be talking about too many things at the same time. No, it can't be. We should have a defined line of action. 10 years from now, what is Africa seeking to achieve? Everybody is talking about trade. Everybody is talking about transport. Everybody is talking about movement. Yes, they are all important. But can we, as a continent, classify and say that the next 10 years, this is the priority? By 10 years from now, Africa should have been able to achieve this, and then we move ahead. We can mix everything up and say that we want to develop. That would be a problem. But the matter on reparation should not be a subject matter of consideration at all. The Honorable Agaga, who spoke in context about what the Honorable Kojo Oppong-Nkrumah said, I equally agree with him. Yes. If you look at what the role that people like Mensa Saba and co-icons of Africa did when colonial masters had wanted to take over our lands, are things that we have to be proud of. So a number of our icons have also stood toe-to-toe to our Europeans. It is entirely not true that Africans largely contributed in the Atlantic slave trade and sold and facilitated the sale of our people to the Europeans. No, There were people, as history has recorded, who stood tall. You can name the Sagranti War and all the likes, and all the people who stood tall to defend Africans and to defend our forefathers. When we are recounting the history, we must recount the history properly. So, Speaker, it's a day we have to celebrate, but reparation should be out of context. And at this stage and at this time in our life, we can't continuously be talking about reparation. Speaker, let me conclude on this $100 million call that Africans have always been looking at the European world, the developed world, that in the context of the fact that these developed countries pollute more, they should send Africans some $100 billion. This has remained a mirage. It's not happening. Year in, year out, at the COP, Conference of Parties, we make that strong advocacy. It only falls on deaf ears, and we come home and we come and lament. It cannot be a litany of lamentation without results. Let's go out there, take our destiny in our hands, demand for fair trade. This is something we call Eurogap standard, which is limiting Africans from penetrating the European world. These are the calls we should make. And I think if we are able to do this out of patriotism, we'll be able to make a difference. 10 years from now, let's come and tick the boxes. Which were the ones that we were able to achieve? Which were the ones that are outstanding? And then we can make a meaningful progress towards the true emancipation of the continent. Speaker, thank you for recognizing me.
Thank you, Majority Leadership. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I also want to wish the African leaders well in the 38th ordinary session that is just about to happen. Mr. Speaker, the issue of reparation is one that divides opinions. But I'm of a strong view that it is not a subject that we Africans or black people should just sweep under the carpet. Yes, there are so many things that we have to do for ourselves. We have said that we do only about 3% of trade among ourselves, that is intra-trade in Africa. And we need to do more. We need to do business with ourselves more than we do with others elsewhere. There are a lot of things. We are sitting on, minerals that are still being exploited from us, and there are so many things that we have to do. But that does not mean that we should forget about the subject of, reparation. Mr. Speaker, injustice has not got a lifespan. It's like justice. And when we talk about reparation, we are always talking about money. Reparation is not only about money. There are other forms of assistance that we can get for what they have done to us. That does not necessarily mean that they have to hand over money to us. My honorable leader was talking about getting an equal trade. How do you get an equal trade? You can use reparation to get that equal trade. You've got to establish that wrong things were done and that somebody needs to compensate the other for. And then we can sit down and look at exactly the form of compensation that we need. Should that be a reduction of tariffs? Should it be other things that we take into the European Union or to the Americas that need to be looked at? We had an agreement with the Americans, the AGOA agreement, which was signed 20 years ago. And we have signed it again, I think, on 2 occasions. And I think the last one is about to expire. But we have not taken advantage of it. These are some of the things we should be looking at. Even if we get a reparation, what sort of advantage as Africans are we going to take to make sure that that benefits us? But we should not just have in our minds that any time we talk about reparation, we are asking for somebody to bring us money. We can do that in negotiating many different agreements, preferably in the area of trade, to make sure that Africa actually gets benefit. We talk about Africans participating. Yes, when you come to Cape Coast, when you come, you will see castles and all that, where these trades actually took place. And yes, you can establish that Africans took part. But as Honorable Agaga said, they were induced to take part. The fight, history will tell you that wars in Africa went up as a result of slave trade, because it became a lucrative business to actually go and fight your neighbor and capture them and sell them to somebody else to take them to the Americas to make money. We were just used as middle people to help the Europeans to do this slave trade or to cause this harm to us. Who benefited from it? Which billionaires do you know that make so much money from slave trade in Africa? But Europe and Americas are littered with all money that trace their sources to the slave trade. And somebody needs to compensate the other for wrongdoing. Mr. Speaker, you realize that a lot of artwork that were stolen from Africa are actually coming back. Quite recently, we got some for the Ashantis. How did we get that? Because we made a case that those arts should be returned to Africa because it belongs to us and they were stolen. If we hadn't made the case, those artwork would still be sitting in Europe. So we should not just sit back, lay back, and say we were a victim of our own, whatever happened to us. No, something went wrong that has not been addressed, and it is still a fundamental thing for we black people, wherever we may find ourselves, whether in Europe, in America, or even here in Africa. And something needs to happen. But let's get into our minds that when we talk about reparation, we are not only talking about payment of money by one person to the other. It can be done in so many other ways that will be beneficial. We are borrowing money at astronomical rate from the Western world. We have appetite for borrowing money. And some of these rates that we are being charged are not actually reasonable, but we don't seem to have the choice. These are some of the areas we can actually negotiate so that some of these rates of borrowing, if we have to, are actually reduced as part of the reparation payment, but not necessarily sitting down for somebody to dole us cash. Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for my contribution, and I thank the maker of the statement for a good job done. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of this statement. Honorable members, I have another statement in the name of Honorable Dr. Stephen Amwa, dealing with certain fundamentals, economic anomalies in Ghana. Honorable, you have the floor. Order.
Sorry. Right, Honorable Speaker, I am extremely thankful to you and your noble outfit for according me this prestigious opportunity to make this important statement in this august house. Mr. Speaker, I am making this statement on certain fundamental financial economic anomalies in Ghana, which need to be rectified. One of such policies is the management of our monetary policy with respect to the periodical adjustments of Ghana's policy rate. Monetary policy is simply about decisions made by central banks, such as the Bank of Ghana makes on the money supply and interest rates. Normally, policy rates are determined to optimize the amount of money in circulation. The strategic technique of adopting inflationary targeted monetary policy in Ghana has not really yielded the expected results. It has rather been a strategic drift. The strategic technique of adopting inflationary targeted monetary policy in Ghana has not really yielded the expected results. It has rather been very dysfunctional and has not helped us as a country. Mr. Speaker, policy rate increased from 12.92% in 2011 to 25% in 2016, with their respective inflationary rates increasing from 8.73% to 17.51%. Policy rate decreased from 22.5% in 2017 to 16.00% in 2019, with their corresponding inflationary rate of 12.39 to 7.17. GDP growth, Mr. Speaker, reduced from 13.90 to 3.4 in the same period. Between 2021 and 2023, GDP reduced from 5.10% to 2.90%. Mr. Speaker, policy rates in 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023 were 14.75%, 14%, 20.21%, and 29.50%. And inflationary rates were 9.94%, 9.96%, 31.949%, and 40.28%, respectively. Inflationary targeted monetary policy, that is the policy rate, is increased to reduce inflation so that the economy can be stabilized. The above trend, Mr. Speaker, illustrates the opposite. Increases in the policy rate rather increases inflation. It means that it is not just the magnitude of the inflation that determines how the monetary policy should be adjusted, but rather the cause of it. Mr. Speaker, this policy anomaly must be checked by the relevant stakeholders to stop its dysfunctional contribution to our unstable economic performance. It erodes the purchasing power of Ghanaians. It increases the cost of doing business and lowers standard of living. It is only when inflation increases as a result of demand pull, that is when people are buying and selling, and there is a high circulation of money on the market, that one can adjust the policy rate upwards, and vice versa. Typically, Ghana's inflation is induced by cost push, that is from the supplier's end. Interest rate has been a very strong element in the aggregate cost of doing business, as most investors in Ghana rely on debt financing, loans. Cost push inflation does not profoundly induce economic growth. In the trends analyzed above, the corresponding GDP growths were not rather following the expected trends. Mr. Speaker, my maiden statement during the 8th Parliament also unraveled another important anomaly. That was the pricing of treasury bills, that is government securities or risk-free as categorized in investment or risk-return principles, and the comparable risky assets on the market. It is making Ghana's market or economy deviate from the global standard. In fact, all the traditional models for computing the returns from investing in risky assets are not effectively applicable in Ghana. It defeats the fundamental principles of risk-return policy in investment. Examples are the capital asset pricing model, that is CAPM, and the arbitrage pricing theorem, APT. It is introducing the element of arbitrariness in the decision-making processes of capital asset pricing in Ghana. Some schools of thought have it that it is as a result of government's high demand for funds. We are dealing with a dysfunctional policy decision and its adverse impact on our economy. All these comments are welcome as they may assist in dealing with the inimical policy. It is indeed, Mr. Speaker, dysfunctional to the performance of the Republic of Ghana. It calls for a policy shift as well as regulatory reforms by the relevant stakeholders. Mr. Speaker, being hungry does not necessitate intake of pathogenic materials or toxins or even poisons. These anomalies contribute not only to the high cost of doing business, but also high exchange rates, low productivity, high unemployment, and banks' risk exposure. Ghanaian companies cannot produce to meet aggregate demand and accordingly resort to importation. Ghana's economy can be accordingly described as double-digit interest rate economy, and it is basically, among other factors, caused by these financial economic anomalies. There are other policies that we need to critically look at. For instance, absolute free market economy, a country in which we have a weak entrepreneurial ecosystem and profiteering culture. We should begin a conversation whether we need a mixed market economy to provide specific price caps, Mr. Speaker, for monopoly, oligopoly, or even cartels. For controlled market economy, Mr. Speaker, I will not advise for a capitalistic economy to be exercised. However, I would like to propose that a committee is set up by the Finance Committee, Economy and Development Committee, and Budget Committee to engage the Bank of Ghana and possibly the Finance Ministry on these important policies. We need to remedy these fundamental anomalies to enable us build a resilient economy for the purposes of attaining the needed long-term economic growth and stability. Without that, our quest for economic independence, national import substitution, strong and stable currency, and high employment rate will never be realized. Mr. Speaker, I would like to end with a plea. Please, I pray that some of these critical issues will be accorded the needed attention and action. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, once again, but in anticipation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Honorable Dr. Stephen Amma. I start a contribution from Honorable Azika Dongo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to commend the maker of the statement who has consistently contributed to improving the economic management principles of our country, particularly monetary policy and capital asset pricing. I recall he made a statement earlier where he questioned the basis for banks that were taking cheaper deposits, basically giving loans at a higher rate than government, which is seen as a risk-free investor, which obviously didn't make sense, given that the banks carry risk that government doesn't. But his own government ended up proving him wrong when the government became more riskier than the banks and began to do DDEP and restructuring its debts, which had basically defeated the common known principle that when you give more loans to government, they are risk-free. So we still are learning, and over time, I'm sure we'll find the solutions to some of them. But I agree in most part with his statement. As a matter of fact, Ghana has been operating an inflationary targeting framework, which is part of the process to anchor inflation expectations. So when inflation is very high in our country and the monetary policy authorities assess that is as a result of increased demand caused by excess liquidity in the economy, what we have tended to do is to adjust the exchange rate in order to recall most of that excess liquidity back into our financial system, but also to give a signal to the community as to direction that we want inflation to go. And we do know that when people expect inflation to be tamed, chances are that inflation will follow suit. But in our absence of adjusting the policy rate, chances are that people will begin to see inflation not being targeted, and as a result, the expectation will be that inflation will continue to grow. And our inflation targeting framework is premised on a combination of inflation targeting and managing inflation expectation. And at the moment, we have not found a better way of doing it. I do agree that monetary policy may not be adequate in dealing with the myriad of problems that are confronted our country, particularly when we know that even though hardcore inflation or headline inflation may be seen to be trending downwards when you increase the policy rate, but if you look at the core measures of inflation, you would find that not all of it can be addressed by policy rate. So, for instance, food inflation. How do you use, what do you call it, policy rate as a major tool for addressing what is essentially a misallocation of resources from the fiscal side? So when a government is not putting the money into agriculture, when the government is not putting the money to grow industries so that we can produce other to substitute for domestic consumption or to reduce the cost of production of food, no amount of policy rate would be able to tackle that. So I agree that there must be complementary fiscal action that makes sure that in the medium term we are able to address a key part of our inflation, which is the food inflation. Of course, there are other factors that are necessarily not food inflation, like energy, like fuel. We will need to find a way to address that. But, Mr. Speaker, where I do have a problem is that monetary policy itself tends to forget that its actions in terms of using policy rate has an impact on the general ability of the economy to grow food and to produce for us. Because, like he said, the cost of borrowing itself is being exacerbated by policy rate increases. Today, we don't do base rate, but we do what we call the Bank of Ghana reference rate. And the Bank of Ghana reference rate is calculated as a weighted average between the policy rate and the treasury bill rate. So it means that anytime treasury bill rates go up or policy rate go up, automatically the reference rate that define the base at which businessmen and individuals must borrow will automatically go up. And if you borrow at a higher rate, it is obvious that your cost of production will go up and the cost of producing food will be high and the cost of producing industrial products will be high. So we need to find a way to deal with this transmission from policy rate to the base rate or the reference rate at which businesses and individuals have to borrow. If we are not able to tackle this, then any time we are attempting to solve the problem of inflation, we are also dealing with the base of the problem itself, which is production, because the cost of production would go up. And once the cost of production goes up, you expect the businessmen to want to recoup all that cost in addition to margins that are placed on the product that are produced. And so in that case, you will see policy rate become dysfunctional, as my colleague calls it. Those of us who attended Zamsis Tech, who don't call it dysfunctional, as you mentioned, we call it dysfunctional. But the Achibota people, they are here. Listen to that man. But so it confirms exactly the fear that he has, that policy rate has a tendency to limit the proper production of goods and services and therefore leading to additional round of inflation and others. But we do also know that the monetary policy is not only targeting inflation, but general price development. So interest rates, exchange rate, and inflation. Now, each of them depend on the other. Once you are not able to deal with exchange rate and you begin to get higher exchange rate volatility, it will feed into the price of goods and services and inflation. Now, in an attempt to address this problem, you then go to touch interest rate, and then you come back in a spiral because that policy rate that you are tackling to use to tackle inflation will then lead to a higher cost of production. So we need to find a model that really understands the dynamics and the structure of our economy. He brings in a very interesting conversation as to what type of economy we should run, whether we should run a market economy or we should find a hybrid. I don't think that we have the answers. This will require a lot of conversation and analysis on our economy. But generally, I do believe that the model that we have set ourselves up itself leads to inefficient utilization and allocation of resources, and we begin to find ourselves in just cycles of the same problem. So a government of the day finds relief, we begin to trumpet an achievement, and just one event, we are back to square one, and then we are criticizing each other once again, and we need to find a way to get out of that. So I want to thank the maker of the statement, and to thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to comment on the statement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Azikadongo. Honorable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity. I'd like to also commend the maker of the statement and also accede to the fact that our policy rates tend to have a positive relationship with our inflation, and as the statistics and the data that he acceded to, and also determine and also let us know that we have almost all the time targeted the opposite. We have almost all the time targeted an inverse relationship, but we don't get that. Mr. Speaker, as we speak, Ghana's policy rate is around 27%, and the corresponding interest rates is between 29.7 and 35%, depending on the bank that you are dealing with and your risk factor that the bank will determine for you. A 2-year average, as we speak now, has been around 29.9%, and a 5-year interest rate average is around 22.3%. Mr. Speaker, we need to understand as a country what really constitutes or what really accounts for our inflation. And as they have already said, whether it is cost push or is demand. Is it the demand that is causing our inflation, or is it the cost that is causing our inflation? And we need to understand these dynamics. Otherwise, whatever policy rate that we decide to bring might not yield the results that we have intended to have. Mr. Speaker, one thing that we need to understand is businesses, when they are finding capital for their businesses, might be from a number of sources, from equity or from debt or from a combination of both or from other sources. We need to understand that in Ghana, most businesses and most entrepreneurs do their financing or their capital mostly from debt. And this is causing a lot of issues for us. If, for example, as the Honorable Adongo said, if the policy rate is, or the interest rate is a combination between the policy rate and also other factors, then it means that, as we have said, if the policy rate goes up...
Honourable members, the Speaker should take the chair.
That means that if the policy rate goes up,
Yes, Honourable Member, you may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, as we said, it means that if the policy rate goes up, then automatically we are also looking at a higher interest rate. Now, I'm just wondering how, when the interest rate goes up, my investor or the entrepreneur in Kwabri East who produces sachet water, Ahinanai sachet water, will be able to borrow at that one and be able to get enough margins on the interest to be able to get enough profit to turn his business around. And the next factor that you have to do is to try to turn your business around. And Mr. Speaker, the business environment in Ghana does not really support turning businesses around quicker, because the average cycle for a business is around 30 to 45 days, and people don't usually buy on cash. So how will a businessman borrow at a higher cost and turn his business around to be able to produce more? And this is really quite a tough ask and a tough challenge for us and for businessmen and business people in Ghana. So it is not sustainable. This high cost of borrowing is not sustainable. And if, per the analysis and the statistics